Hello, I'm John Stevens. I was born in Toronto in 1932. I have two brothers and a sister who were all younger. And just before that time, my family had been at Presqu'ile for probably 90 years up to 2018. And my grandfather built a large addition to the Brighton Hotel. And in the process of doing that, they had to bring the lumber from Trenton on a barge through the Murray Canal. He worked on that for several years while camping in a tent. And after he was finished doing that, he built a cottage of his own. He moved it from the area around the hotel, which was quite busy, to an area which is now approximately the area of the Park store. And while he was doing that, he and the family camped every summer. And shortly after that, in 1932, I was born, and I've been around this area ever since. The cottage took several stages. It was built initially without a front porch, and it didn't have a big fireplace, but gradually over the years it was expanded. It was very nice outside, but the inside was left fairly raw, and the studs on the walls, they used to write every fall when they'd have a hunting and fishing party, they'd write their names on the 2x4 studs, and probably 15, 20 years worth of signatures on there from men and women that used to come and spend time at the cottage. My grandmother and my grandfather were very interested in fishing. My grandfather fished all the time, and my grandmother cleaned them and cooked them. And we had probably, most times in the summer, probably about 15 people there. So it was a very busy spot. My father, John Stevens, I guess I'm John Stevens III, by the way, and my son is John Stevens IV. Anyway, he worked for, or at least he worked for the Eaton Company, but in his spare time he was working with a group like the St. John's Ambulance that did first aid. And I guess in 1942, that whole group was enlisted in the war. Now, I've never been able to understand why a man with 4 children under the age of 8 would be enlisted in the war and would go overseas. But it happened. He started out as a sergeant, and he took courses in England to become a lieutenant, apparently headed up his class of about 200 men, and was given his choice of units to join. And he went with the 6th Field Ambulance. And in Sicily, he fought with the various groups. But one of the things I wanted to mention was that I have a picture of him leaving our cottage in Brighton and Presqu'ile. And it was the last time any of the family ever saw him. And he then went directly overseas, took the course, and landed in Sicily with the Royal Marines from the British Royal Marines. He had been assigned with a group of about 20 men to support them as an ambulance and first aid group during the landing. As a matter of fact, the commander of the Royal Marines gave him a Marine beret in honor of his service. And one of the things that happened, I was talking to my boss at work one day, many years after, and I said to him, what's the matter with your knee? And he said, oh, I was at Sicily. I was a lieutenant in the Royal Marines, and I broke my knee climbing a rope ladder. And so I found out that my boss had actually been serviced and gave him his first aid and then put him back on the ship to go back to England. So it was a real coincidence all the way around. Later on, we found out that my dad had been killed when somebody sent a telegraph to my aunt in Toronto, and she brought the telegram down to Brighton during the summer, and we were told that my dad had been killed 2 weeks before in Sicily. So Brighton, Presqu'ile, featured again. It was a really sad time. In 1942, there had been a golf course at Presqu'ile, and it had a clubhouse, and it had a 9-hole course. It ran from approximately where the park store is now, north towards the entrance of the park, and it ran 4 holes north, and then there was one par 3 headed west towards the lake, and then 4 holes back. One of the people that looked after things there was Johnny Connors. He was a gentleman who had a horse, and he plowed and cut grass and did all the chores around the golf club. And every day he would come on his horse and buggy and arrive at the golf course in the morning. And when he was leaving in the afternoon, I used to hop on. I was just a very small kid. I used to hop on, and he'd give me a ride, maybe half a mile up. He would go along the beach towards Lakehurst, and I would hop off and walk back to the cottage. And I only discovered, I don't know, 30 years after I was married to my wife Eleanor, that she used to meet him at the other end of his trip and hitch a ride. And we only found out years later that we had both done the same thing as youngsters. In addition to the club, Eleanor's dad had won the golf championship there one year, and my dad used to golf. He was actually at some point in time in his life a caddy master at a club in South Carolina. But Presqu'ile, the golf club, a lot of the people that came to the cottage used to golf there, and of course people from town. But it was because of the war in 1940s, in 1943, 4, somewhere there, the golf course was discontinued and it wasn't used anymore. It became a snack shop for the beach, basically. Although all my life I've been associated with Presqu'ile, and it has always been kind of bothering me a little that our family cottage was repossessed by the creation of the park. However, we've always enjoyed the park and have gone there for years, but I do remember back when it was a really different feeling about the place, and particularly where the cottages are. It was always just sort of a fun place. There was entertainment with the dance hall. There was the dock where boats from all over North America used to come and moor their boats, the sailors. They used to start the Freeman Cup race across Lake Ontario from that location. They used to have tennis courts beside the hotel, and we previously mentioned the golf course, but they had regattas every year. They had what they call the Calathumpian Parade, which moved around the different cottages in costume. And they had a ball diamond there where we used to have weekend ball games against the Presqu'ile against Brighton, or Presqu'ile against Gosport, more likely. And there was an airfield there that planes used to land, which also was the softball location. There was a sort of an entertainment feel about the whole thing, and as I see it now, particularly where the cottages and homes are, it's a residence. It's just doesn't seem to have the fun and the entertainment that it used to. In the early 1950s, I was working full-time at Simpson's, which was a retail store in Toronto, which no longer exists. And I was not well paid. I guess it was about $30 a week. And so I didn't have a car. And I guess one time my kids had asked me, what had you earned when you were first working at Simpson's? And I said, well, $2.85. And they said, well, you know, with inflation, $2.85 an hour isn't too bad. I said, no, $2.85 a day, $14 a week was what I started at. But a few years later, when I was coming to Brighton, I had to hitchhike, and it had been arranged that Eleanor Roblin was a friend of the Scanlons, and we would go on a date together, sort of a blind date. And we were going to go to the Club Commodore in Belleville for dancing. I had to hitchhike down to Brighton, and I arrived at Scanlon House, who had arranged this date. And there was a note on the door and said, well, we've gone. Just use the car that's in the driveway and meet us there. So I got in the car and I drove to Belleville. And when I got there, they said, where's Eleanor? I hadn't realized that they hadn't all gone. And so I had to come back with my tail between my legs to Brighton, and about 2 hours late, and knock on the door and say, here I am. We spent a little time. We drove over to Presqu'ile, went for a coffee, and came back. I guess despite that terrible incident, we've been married 62 years in 2018.